The Vikings put the city of Paris to the ultimate test in a battle that had the potential to change the course of history forever. But the ancient French, or Franks if you may, were undefeated. How were they able to defend their city against the horde of skilled Viking invaders? Well, in this video, we're going to learn about some of the tactics and heroics that saved Paris during one of the most suspenseful sieges in history. The Vikings began attacking Western Europe in the late 700s, and their first major raid on the holy island of Lindisfarne near England's northwest coast in 793 marked the beginning of what we now call the Viking Age. The Vikings, who were expert sailors of the shallow waters of the North, the Celtic Seas, and the English Channel, always looked for valuable places to raid within the British Isles and Western Europe. At first, these daring Vikings would go out in small groups, sailing in just 1 to 3 ships. But as they got bigger and stronger, so did their fleets, sometimes swelling to an impressive 200 longships for larger raids. The powerful design of their ships were what made the Vikings so successful. These ships had shallow hulls, allowing them to sail beaches or riverbanks. This ability gave the Vikings the advantage of jumping off quickly and attacking towns and villages where people least expected them. After many initial coast raids, the Vikings started traveling deeper into Europe, treating major rivers like roads that led them to new and richer targets. Soon, they were in France. But what were the events leading to the Vikings' siege in France? After Charles the Bald passed away in 877, West Francia faced a period of instability, with many kings taking the throne for only short periods. This continued until 884, when Charles the Fat, who was already ruling Germany and Italy, became the king. Just 1 year after Charles the Fat took the throne, the Vikings organized their most ambitious attack, coming fully for Paris. In late November, they arrived with hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors. They initially demanded a payment to leave the city peacefully, which Odo, the Count of Paris, refused to give. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Odo was determined to defend the city. Rollo, a formidable Viking chieftain, had taken control of the Seine estuary and territories leading up to 50 miles inland, and this strategic position put Paris within easy reach of a Viking attack. In July 885, a large group of Vikings, led by Rollo and Earl Sigfrid, gathered in this area. Both Rollo and Sigfrid were predominant figures, but neither had total control of the Viking forces, which also included several smaller groups. As the threat to Paris grew more serious, the city began to brace itself. Initially, Rollo and Sigfrid didn't demand money or goods. Instead, they asked permission to sail freely up the Seine River. However, the city's co-commanders Odo and Goslin were not intimidated by their threats. After their request for free passage was denied, the Vikings attacked Paris on November 26th, aiming to take the city by storm. The battle raged around the city's towers, where the defenders and attackers clashed. The Grand Chalet, a key point in the city's defenses, saw some of the heaviest fighting. Unable to force the gates open, a group of Vikings started to chip away at the tower's base. In response, the defenders employed a desperate but effective tactic. They mixed oil, wax, and pitch into a liquid, heated in a furnace, and poured it over the attacking Vikings. Those struck by the fiery mixture cried in agony, while others were forced to jump into the river to quench the flames. After several hours of intense combat, the Vikings were forced to retreat. However, they had managed to damage the tower's foundation, but just couldn't breach the defenses due to the excellent resistance of the Paris defenders. The Franks must have been really strong. During the night, the Franks repaired and fortified the Grand Chalet. Both Count Odo and Bishop Goslin played crucial roles in the battle, not just in strategy, but also in boosting morale. Their leadership and presence were vital in keeping panic at bay among the troops. They absolutely needed it. As the Great Siege of Paris continued, the Vikings didn't give up on their efforts. In a smart move, they dismantled a belfry from one of the local churches and used it as a mobile attack tower. And so, from this mobile tower, they launched arrows at the city's defenders. It's unclear if the Vikings used siege engines during their attacks. However, it's possible that they knew about these devices from their previous battles against the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks. Given that their long ships were designed to allow them to travel farther upriver quickly, it's also unlikely that Rollo and Siegfried initially brought any heavy siege artillery with them. Despite this, the Vikings built several siege weapons after they arrived. With these new tools at their disposal, they mounted another assault, but the city's defenders quickly responded, moving to the areas under attack and fighting back fiercely. Their defensive efforts were effective, taking a heavy toll on the Viking attackers. The Vikings didn't see that coming. During this battle, the Vikings used poisonous arrows to try and gain an advantage. However, even with this tactic, the attack lost momentum after several hours of intense fighting and ended without significant success for the invaders. Through December and into January of 886, the Vikings continued to launch attacks at different times, mainly targeting the Grand Chalet. Despite their efforts, they couldn't capture the stronghold. Frustrated by their failures, the Vikings tried a new strategy in early February. On February 2nd, 886, they carried 3 ships overland, bypassing parts of the city and put them back in the water upriver. Their plan was to load these ships with firewood, set them on fire, and then let them drift toward the Grand Pont Bridge. However, the city's defenders quickly reacted and used water from the river to quench the fires on the ships. During this attack on the bridge, the Vikings made a big mistake by leaving their battering rams unguarded. Seizing the opportunity, the defenders launched a counterattack, stormed out, and managed to capture and destroy 2 Viking rams. This bold move by the Franks weakened the siege capabilities significantly. They thought maybe the Vikings would finally leave. Well, that wasn't what they did. As winter came, the siege grew more difficult for everyone involved. The Vikings, camped outside the city, faced the added discomfort of constant rains. Then, on the night of February the 6th, the situation took a dramatic turn when the rain-swollen Seine River overflowed, causing the supports of the wooden Petit Pont Bridge to fail. The following day, the Vikings launched an attack, seizing the opportunity presented by the collapsed bridge. The tower was defended by only a dozen brave Franks. Despite being outnumbered and under a barrage of arrows from the defenders, the Vikings pushed forward with a wagon load of hay and set it on fire near the tower. The goal was to burn down the wooden structure and capture that strategic point, a goal which they achieved. Meanwhile, with the Petit Pont Bridge out of the way, the restless Earl Siegfried led a large contingent of Vikings further up the Seine River. Back in Paris, Rollo was just determined to keep pressing for control. He led another attack on the Grand Chalet to secure a permanent foothold on the Seine River. However, this assault too was turned back by the determined defenders of Paris. As the siege continued, life inside Paris grew increasingly worse, especially because a plague broke out and took many lives. Among those lost to the disease was Goslin, one of the city's key leaders. His death was a significant blow to the Parisians, who were already struggling to survive the prolonged Viking siege. In October 886, as Paris continued to withstand the Viking siege, King Charles the Fat arrived with a large force gathered from various regions. The Parisians who had been defending their city hoped for relief and a decisive battle against the Vikings. However, quite shockingly, King Charles decided to negotiate with the Viking leader Rollo. During the negotiations, Charles the Fat offered Rollo 700 pounds of silver, which he was to share with his ally Siegfried in exchange for ending the siege and leaving Paris. Since this was a huge amount, Charles asked for time until March 887 to gather the funds. Meanwhile, he granted the Vikings permission to freely raid the Duchy of Burgundy, which was rebelling against his rule. The Vikings took advantage of this offer and spent several months raiding in Burgundy. During this period, they tried but failed to capture the city of Sens. Eventually, Rollo and Siegfried returned to Paris in late 886. Keeping his promise, King Charles paid the agreed tribute, and the Vikings finally withdrew from Paris. Siegfried then headed to Friesland, where he was eventually killed in battle. Rollo ended up with a much better deal after the siege. Besides the sum of silver, King Charles the Fat awarded him a land grant along the lower Seine River. Rollo established his headquarters in Rouen, and unlike similar grants given to other Viking leaders, which eventually were taken back by local forces, Rollo's remained secure. This area under his control came to be known as the Land of the Norsemen, who, over time, were called the Normans. One of Rollo's direct descendants, William the Conqueror, would go on to rule England in the 11th century. Meanwhile, King Charles the Fat's reputation suffered greatly among the Frankish nobility because he decided to negotiate rather than fight, and he died in January 13th, 888.